a resource person from the UK and also from East Africa as well. I would like to give a very brief introduction to our resource person, of our keynote address speaker, Dr. Charles Redman, who is a lecturer, Department of Language and Linguistics, University of Essex, United Kingdom. His primary works revolves around the intersection of phonetics, psycholinguistics, and computing, especially language computing. His research also covers areas like morphology, historical linguistics, Germanic, and language families, especially in Southeast Asian region. And I believe he has a paper on the Pom Naga language as well. He has several publications in books, journals, and has presented several papers in conferences. Some of his current teaching responsibilities include forensic linguistics, computing and language, and phonology. And with this brief introduction, I would like our keynote address speaker to introduce the main theme of the conference.
Is really, this what was introduced previously, this whole big AI boom and what it means for the Northeast, and what some of the things I've been thinking about are around the last few years. So here's a sort of outline of what I'll go through. Just talk about kind of how do we get here, and you may have your own experiences getting here and own thoughts on that. A brief survey of different language technologies that have been developed in Northeast India, and I won't be able to cover everything, but it will give a kind of snapshot of the current state of play that we're in. And then I'll use that to discuss some of the constraints on development and then some of the implications for this theme of decolonization. And I recognize that I'm speaking on decolonization coming to you from the colonizer's country in the UK, so you can make of that what you will. And then finally, I'll just conclude with a general discussion and really hope to get some input from people and maybe forge some future collaborations. Okay, so how did we get here? This is a sort of rough snapshot of where we are now, some of the big milestones. Really a lot has happened in the last couple of decades, really spawned by a hardware change. So NVIDIA basically created graphics cards that were then able to be used for deep learning models, and that rapidly scaled out this boom in AI models that hadn't really been done before at that level. So before, you would have needed a big supercomputer, and then with these new technologies, you could do it sort of on your laptop. Then people started to hit a kind of bottleneck, and then Google releases a model called the Transformer, which overcomes that. And really, this big GPT model from OpenAI, which kind of sparked all the current craze, that was just applying Google's model to a large set of data. So what they did was if you're not familiar with the story, they increased the size of their model by 10 times, and they didn't get any sort of plateau or leveling off. And that made everybody think, oh, wow, we can just throw a bunch of data at these models and get better performance. So then in 2022, you all may have had your first encounters with ChatGPT. And really there was no big advance there over 2018, but by allowing people to interact with the model, that suddenly changed how people thought about this, and that led to all kinds of investment and new things. And just latest, I thought I'd add, very recently, DeepSeek coming out with their open source model has really changed the landscape of who we think needs to control these models. Okay, so what sparked my focus? I mean, I'm primarily interested in phonetics and questions around that. But I've been kind of sucked into this field for reasons not always under my control. So in 2023, Facebook published a paper, and you may have seen this, titled Scaling Speech Technology to 1,000+ languages. So they outlined in that paper their plan to expand AI to all the world's languages, which is the kind of ambitious undertaking that only a Silicon Valley company could dream of doing. And I thought, oh wow, that's kind of wild. I wonder what languages are in here. And I found a bunch of languages that I was familiar with, but I had no idea how they got the data to build the models with. And in the paper, they write that they use this open access Bible corpus of text and audio readings to train the models. So with no real concern about whether that's an appropriate set of data to use for these models. And you all may have your own experiences with Bible translations, and it's a very particular kind of language. It's not the most representative use. And most concerning for me was the fact that I couldn't find any native speakers, at least of the languages that I was aware of, that were involved in this project. So they were producing all kinds of estimates of how great their model was performing in, say, a language like Garo, but there were no clear indications of any Garo speakers that had been involved in the project, had tested it or provided feedback, and it was quite concerning to me. So what this means for the road ahead, I think, is that we need to develop networks and institutions to safeguard the interests of the people who speak the languages that are being put into these models. And I think we have to do that quite quickly. So, these large multinational corporations, they're going to go ahead with their work. We can't really stop them, and we can't count on them to consider the needs of the speakers when they're developing these models. So the only way forward is for us to have our own groups, our own networks, to then respond to what they produce, try to produce our own things, and try to develop a force that can sort of monitor what's being produced, point out errors or flaws or problematic uses of data. This has been done in some language contexts, like in New Zealand, for instance, where some communities have pushed back against use of their data. So I think that's where we need to be moving forward. Okay, so just going to talk a bit about the Northeast, at least sort of what I've been able to gather through looking around at what's been produced, and also looking at different institutions and what they've been producing. But I know this will just be a snapshot. And why focus on the Northeast? Well, partly interest from my own background in doing research on languages in the region. But I've done some work on resource development, though it's much more limited than I would like. And so I'm hoping that within the next year or so, I can actually get there in person and start doing more work on this. So I started work on a Garo pronouncing dictionary in 2018 that is sort of still in development due to some members of the team disappearing. And then also had this project on POM, so a little closer to home for you all, where we're interested in sort of orthography and whether it captures the phonology or not, and how you handle that. Northeast is quite interesting because it's a representative snapshot of the range of access and degrees of constraints on resource development. So you all are very familiar with this being there, but you have languages spoken by both large and quite small communities, languages with different written and spoken traditions. You have languages with different degrees of social, political, or economic power. So you can have, scheduled languages. You can have languages that are very largely used in the state, but you can have much smaller languages that are only really used in a district level. And of course, you have vast complexity in multilingualism, creolization, and this is changing quite rapidly too, I can see. And yeah, just a disclaimer, so there's many people actively working in this area whose work I'm indebted to, and so my goal is to kind of review what they've been producing and provide some big picture thoughts on future trajectories. Okay, so I'm going to go through some big technologies, and I'll try to outline sort of what they are and what they do, and look at what the broad state of play is in the region. So On the kind of audio side, you have things like speech recognition, speech synthesis. So these are like your Siris and Alexas, these kind of pieces of software. So any technology to process or generate audio. And the fundamentals of this have really been solved, or mostly solved, for several decades, but you need a lot of data. You need a lot of data to train these models. Data storage and computing power has been generally quite sparse. So even though we know kind of how to train them well, it doesn't mean that we have been able to do so for all the languages we're interested in. These are quite vital technologies if you think about them, because for certain accessibility questions, so say screen readers for the blind, you need these technologies in order to have it work in the language that you want it to work in. And if you look around at the sort of major commercial systems, so the kinds of things that you'll find on your computer or on your phone, there's really not much coverage at all. So Siri, Alexa, and Google have coverage for Hindi, which is not really indigenous to the Northeast region, but is still spoken in certain areas, particularly Arunachal. And then Bengali, more widespread, but again, sort of in pockets around the Northeast, and that's you can access through Siri and Google. But really no other languages in the region. This shouldn't really come as a surprise, but companies develop technologies based on economics more than anything else. And till date, they haven't found it economically suitable to them to develop, say, Siri for SMEs or Siri for OW or whatever. Pick your favorite language. So if you look at the map of the Northeast, I'm sort of roughly color coding these sort of darker ones as having more technologies and data availability, and the sort of grayed out ones are the ones where there's really, I shouldn't say there's nothing available, but nothing that's sort of widely published, and maybe that's a point we can come back to. So sometimes there are things in development that aren't at a stage yet where they are going to be widely published, or they're published in a different kind of format, so they're harder to find. So take all of these with a grain of salt. But of course, you can see Assam there in a big, the darkest, the most resources. So if we look at speech data, there's a few different things. There's this nice corpus that's been developed in Arunachal, which has several languages: Adi, Nishi, Galo, Apatani. So that's been used for a number of technologies. So just the existence of that has allowed for a lot more than you would normally expect. But limited availability of other speech corpora. SMEs, interestingly, I think that there are these corpora that exist, but they're not sort of widely published on, or they're more like specialized cases. Okay, I'm just conscious I can't see the video link anymore. Am I still audible?
Hello. Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Just didn't want to talk to myself. All right. So in terms of speech recognition systems, you find these for languages like Assamese and Bro. There's quite a lot, and then some other big languages in the region. So Kasi has some, Mizo, Meitei, and Adi as well, which is a bit smaller, but has some development behind it. What you'll find in general is that the languages that have these technologies produced for them, there's usually a clear reason behind that. It often clusters around where the kind of big engineering centers are. So of course, IIT Guwahati is a big driver of a lot of these technologies, and so the reason that you have a lot of things for SMEs and Bodo and Mizo as well, because there's a lot of Mizo researchers who have gone to IIT Guwahati. So that's really driving that big push, not just the sort of size of the languages, but if you have a prominent engineering school in your region, you're more likely to have researchers producing these things. So similar sort of set of languages for spoken language identification. So, just if you get a set of audio, can you identify what language it is? That's often necessary as a precursor to doing any speech recognition. But still, if you think about the hundreds of languages spoken in the region, this is quite a small sample, and it's not very widely distributed. There's other work on more specialized cases. So there's a couple of projects that have been done on emotion recognition, other things on, say, recognizing tone or recognizing specific speakers, and then quite a bit, interestingly, on handwriting recognition. Though again, there's no sort of systematicity to which languages are developing these things. So often it will be, if an engineer, if a faculty member has a particular expertise in, say, handwriting recognition, and they are at an engineering school in Manipur, then there will be these technologies developed for that. So it's sort of piecemeal. And yeah, so speech synthesis, less so in development, but there are a few sort of published cases. And I know that there are some small sort of products being produced by smaller startup companies as well. So we can come to the question of company products a bit later. So this is just to give a snapshot of some of the things that are out there. So we've got sort of bits and pieces, but far from what we would need to have actual robust AI systems. So moving on to another area, parsing, which is more at the text level. So tools for morphology or syntax or semantics. This generally requires a lot more linguistic knowledge, and so it's sometimes harder to build these systems. They also depend on text data. So if you have a language that's not written, or even if it is written, if it's not sort of widely used in a written form, this is going to cause problems for developing these. But you also need expertise in researchers to develop them. So hopefully this is inspiration for students to get involved here. So again, if you sort of look at the map, we get a little bit of different distribution, but it is still kind of spotty, and the big regions are regions like Assam and Manipur seem to have quite a lot in this area. Again, a lot due to the influence of big engineering universities in the region. So we have various text corpora that are available out there. These aren't all of them, but there are several. So you have sort of references. I'll find a way to share the slide. So if you have an interest in a particular language, you can see, but also if your language is not there, we can talk about filling in those gaps. And some machine readable lexicons, these are quite useful as well, but not a whole lot has been published on these. And then sort of morphological analyzers. The morphology in languages of the Northeast India is quite complex, and so these are quite important tools, but there's not a whole lot that's been developed, at least that I could surmise. But you have some on Kasi, Koporok, Mete, and some sort of morphology generators for SMEs, and some various tools, stemmers for different languages. But you see the sort of same handful of languages coming back up again and again. So, and unfortunately, Nagaland is quite sparsely represented, at least in these areas. But again, that may be due to sort of lack of wider publication, even if the tools are in development. There's a lot more on syntax parsing. So you get these part of speech taggers in a wide variety of languages. These are a bit easier to build, but they're quite useful. And so this is a sort of low-hanging fruit, I think, for languages that don't have these yet. It's certainly something that could be done as a master's project, for instance. And again, the same sort of, bits and pieces, a few languages here and there for other parsers. Named entity recognition is really important for information extraction. So if I want to gather up all of the news articles, for instance, or texts that feature a particular person or institution and find out some information on how that person or institution is linked to some other semantic information, then I need these kind of tools. And again, SME's has not well represented, but has some articles on it. Miso and Mete are also quite well represented. There's various semantic models out there. These are not as useful, but they can be interesting, and they're sometimes used in sort of social media research and marketing. But again, not very widespread, quite focused on a handful of languages. And there's some stuff on text summarization, but again, not a whole lot. Assamese, Bodo, Miso, Mete. So again, you see the sort of same ones again and again. And then lastly, just wanted to give a snapshot of machine translation. So this is quite much easier, more self-explanatory, the usefulness of this. Most work, and I'll just assume going forward, so if you look into these, it's mostly focused on translating to and from English. And when you read papers or descriptions on this, the assumption is often that English might be the link that then allows you to traverse between several other languages. So if you want to go from Bodo to Miso, if you go through English, then that allows you to do that without going straight from Bodo to Miso. But you can see the obvious problems. English is going to distort a lot of things along the way in translation, and anybody who has sort of deep expertise in translation knows how much these machine systems can be flawed. So that's a potential problem. And interestingly, so there is some growing development at the commercial level. Google Translate does have a surprising number of languages from the region. So you do see Assamese, Miso, Kasi, Kokoro, Mete. I'd be curious how good these translations are, though. And so one thing I'll talk about later is whether we can do more to evaluate them, because there's often not a whole lot written on how reliable these different kind of online translation systems are, how much we can depend on them. Yeah, so this is sort of what it broadly looks like. And these are some of the languages that have had academic research done on them. Though, of course, we saw before that there's some other languages that are implemented in these larger company systems. One of the problems with the sort of corporate or industry products is they don't always produce papers or even documentation on what they've made. So it's not always easy to tell how they've made the system they've made, how they tested it, how they evaluated it. Oftentimes you just get a sort of brief blog that says you can use this language, and that's about it. So it's quite hard without doing a more rigorous assessment to know how well these are supported. And a lot of this research is sort of preliminary stages, so it's not yet in a commercial product that somebody could use on their phone or on their computer. So when we look around, I think it's important to think about what kinds of constraints we're dealing with and how to maybe resolve them. So one issue is domain coverage. So the work that we see is limited to quite a small number of researchers. So if you look back when I send around the slides, you can see the same sort of names over and over again. That's both a testament to their hard work and expertise, but it also means that there's just not many people working in this field, and so the coverage is imbalanced. And so if you have a researcher who has expertise in, say, speech acoustics, then they will develop many technologies on that side, but not necessarily, machine translation technologies. And so depending on where you get your experts, it seems that a lot of the experts in Arunachal Pradesh are on the speech side, so they tend to develop more speech recognition, speech synthesis technologies, whereas in other regions you might have expertise in a different domain. So that ends up being quite sparse. One big problem is data availability. So for a lot of things, before you can even build a model, you need the language and speech data, especially with the more state-of-the-art models that require a lot of data. And sometimes this data just simply doesn't exist. So we need to first do the projects to collect the data before we can even get to the point where we're trying to build, say, a chatbot or something. So we don't have the luxury that, say, English had, where there's just all this data that's freely floating around on the internet and people could scrape it and use it to build their models. In many cases, we have to collect this ourselves. That's obviously challenging. And there would be certain barriers that you'd hit. If the language is not commonly written, then what kind of data are you collecting? And then commercialization is still a big hurdle. So we often need to do the research before we can make these products, but if they're not ever turned into usable products, then they're not really going to impact people's lives, and that can be a challenge as well, getting to that stage where you can put it in an app that people will use on their phone or on their computer. And then finally, there's a big gap in community engagement. So companies will sometimes do like focus groups and things like that to see how their product is performing, but we don't really do this systematically for these tools to see how people use them, what they want, what they don't want, what problems they see, and that's something I think we need to consider a lot in the future. So ways around the constraints, I think through coordination, we can look at some different gaps and suggest sort of areas where one language might need more focus on a certain kind of technology because it's missing that, whereas it might have other expertise in a different area. For data, I think this is a great opportunity. So any students in the room or sort of faculty who supervise students, if you're writing a bachelor's or master's thesis, this can be a really good opportunity to collect data that can be then quite useful to people later on. So it's a lower barrier to entry. You don't need tons and tons of knowledge and expertise to produce these data sets, but they're immensely valuable. So I think I hope that we can capitalize on that as an opportunity to grow the data that we have. And we need to think more carefully about how to handle languages that are not commonly written in formal settings. So one suggestion was, people are writing a lot on WhatsApp. Is there a way to ask people to provide anonymized WhatsApp conversations as a way to train models or collect data? Of course, that comes with ethical questions, but I think I'll get into that in a bit. And yeah, so with recent activity from companies like Facebook and Google, I think on the commercial side, we need to be testing their systems and identifying where they're flawed, where they're not working. And I think just at a basic level, we need to do a lot of surveying to find out how people engage with technology and sort of what they would need or want or not want. So particularly with all the multilingualism that we have in India, and particularly in the Northeast, it may be that somebody speaks 3 languages and the language that they use for technology is different from, say, their mother tongue. So we cannot always assume that they're going to want to engage with their mother tongue in certain technologies. So they may have a priority. Okay, now to the big questions. So these are just my observations, and I think others in the conference will put it more precisely and elegantly who do more work on this. But I think AI is potentially a major shift and a major neo-colonial product if we're not careful. So there's been a long-standing concern about colonialism in education, or just really the general homogenization of education, where around the world everybody is sort of gravitating towards the same type of teaching, the same type of classrooms, the same content. We're all just studying reading and math essentially, and a few other things. But AI, I think, poses a new threat for a couple of reasons. So there are two concerns that I've had that I think are worth sharing. You may have others. The one is there's an inherent bias and narrowness in the scope that is hardwired into these algorithms. So because they're trained on largely whatever they've hoovered up from the internet, and that's largely focused on a small set of languages from a very limited context, then they produce a very particular worldview. And as students write and study more with these tools, we may find them approaching some kind of central mean, some average sort of way of looking at things or way of analyzing things. So I think there's a lot of concern around, are people going to maintain their diversity of thought if they're trying to funnel everything through these quite general algorithms? So that's one concern. And it's just supercharging what has already happened in the curriculum prior to AI. And then there's been a lot of emphasis, maybe you've seen this from a lot of these education technology corporations, on personalized learning. And I think the intentions are good, but this does presume that education is centered on the individual. And so you can see how this comes from a very particular, largely Western idea about how, the perfect model of learning is an individual studying to their own needs and desires. And not every part of the world, not every community has that conception. So many people would say that actually learning is collective. There's an important need for people to learn as a group and engage with each other as a group. If everything is sort of hyper-tailored to the individual, does that do something to the way that we teach and the way that people learn in different cultural contexts? And a further point of difference, I think, which many of us, I think, are thinking about and worried about, is that a lot of the reason that so many of these technologies are being developed and being promoted and invested in is because there's a belief that they will provide some kind of cost savings and efficiencies. But we shouldn't be shy about this fact. We shouldn't ignore the fact that, people wouldn't be investing billions into OpenAI if they didn't think they could later replace tons of workers with a few models and not have to, deal with the pesky things that all these humans cause. So if that's the case, then as educators, we need to be wary of the sort of erosion of local knowledge and experience in the classroom that will result from this. So if there's a way to reduce the reliance on experienced teachers by using more of these AI models, then what does that do to the kind of transmitted knowledge that we can have in our classrooms? But I would say that we're not helpless to these changes. So the more we understand the models and their consequences, I think the better we can promote their responsible use. It's really hard to fight back against some of these changes if you don't have a sort of active stake in them and you don't understand them, or you're not trying to sort of develop your own alternatives. And there are some other opportunities if we have greater control. So one is they may lower the barrier to producing materials in local languages. So if we are able to build better and more reliable machine translation systems, maybe that can allow us to translate many more textbooks and other materials and then revise them and have experts sort of go through and tailor them. But if you think about how long it would take to produce tons of materials in 60 different languages in Nagaland, if we can have some tools that can speed that up, but still then revise them later, that could be an opportunity. And then more directly, language technologies could be used to make it easier for younger generations to preserve community languages and dialects. So, we can make language learning apps, and there are companies that are doing this already, where, maybe somebody speaks Nagamese mostly with their friends, but their parents speak two different languages in Nagaland, and they don't really speak either of them well. But, at some point when they're a teenager or older, they want to learn those languages better, if we can provide those tools, does that give them a new opportunity to engage that's not completely dependent on asking their parents to teach them better, which is not always possible. And then finally, I mean, we do need to recognize that there is a role for learning environments that don't have technology in them. So we don't have to just go along and say that everything is technology driven. There is a value to learning outside of technology, and we have to be judicious about when we use that. Okay, so there's a lot of future directions, and I think we can get to some of these in Q&A, but I haven't discussed creoles like Nagamese or Arunachali Hindi, and these are often not studied because they're not considered to be sort of typical languages or things that are worthy of developing technologies for, but they're often things that people speak quite widely and might want to use in a technology. There's been a lot of focus on AI access, but this assumes that AI is good, and I'm not so sure it always is. So I think we also need to ask, what are the consequences of linking in certain languages with the AI revolution? Do we want chatbots in all of these languages, or do people want their language to be sort of withheld from that change? Do we want a lot of the text in some of these languages to be generated by robots rather than humans? So I think these are worthy questions to ask. AI access is not always a good thing. And yeah, so who's responsible for the data and tools? How do we ensure it reflects communities' needs and values? And this is always going to be a constant conversation. Okay, so finally is just my appeal to collaboration. So you can see I don't have many answers, but the main thing I want is to improve sort of communication and connectivity around this. So I have a group that I set up last year, but I've been sort of struggling to get off the ground and get involvement from, but it's called the Language Computing Monitor, and we're trying to initially start just tracking the developments in different languages and then using that as a means of directing efforts in different directions, and also potentially providing a voice when new big models are released to evaluate them, to provide responses, to maybe say, hey, Facebook, your translation model for this language is really problematic and full of errors, and you need to fix it. So if you're interested, there's a website, and we have a Discord server where we're chatting about this. So again, I'll share these around somehow, and then hopefully I'll see you all online, and hopefully in person. I hope to get there within the next year. Okay, so thank you. Any questions?
Each and everyone to our college, Kohima Science College. The NEP 2020 is very comprehensive, and its implementation is very overwhelming. And I'd like to congratulate the organizers and the sponsors for selecting a topic which is in line with the NEP 2020. The rise of digital information technology is very rapid, and it has fundamentally changed the way we obtain our informations and do research. And it will be very interesting today to see how the digital humanities position yourself in this landscape, today's education landscape. And at the same time, our discussions, our discourse on the decolonization of the education is multifaceted, and we should have a multi-pronged approach. And we should see that this discussion should create a very inclusive and equitable knowledge system. And this is, I think, a very challenging area, and it will be interesting to see how our discussions go. I would like to encourage all the participants to be very actively engaged in this very interesting discussion, and our outcome will be beneficial to all the participating organizations and also the students in general. With this, I would like to welcome you to Kohima Science College, and on the behalf of the entire college fraternity, I would like to wish you all a happy stay here. Thank you.
We shall now have greetings brought to us by Dr. Madamoy Rako, the Deputy Director, Department of Higher Education. Sir, you may take your time.
Digital humanities, and you are talking about decolonization. But I would like to share little on the genesis of how this colonization took place in history. When we look back, the first wave was more on agricultural revolutions, where land was considered as capital. And because of agricultural revolutions and land was considered as capital, geographical and territorial expansion of different countries, because of which First World War took place. That is all about to do with colonization and expansion of territory and geography. And the second wave is to do with industrial revolution, where invention discoveries took place and production was no more a problem. But when people look for the market with the industrialization and the industrial revolution, different marketing policies to do with politics, where Second World War was fought. That is all to do with, and the world was divided into communism and capitalism. Now, when we look back to the third wave, we talk about that software age. And in this software age, our education, our economy, everything is controlled by data. We don't consider land as capital. We don't consider as means of productions like industries as capital, but human brain as the capital. And now we are not just in the third wave, but we are proceeding to the fourth wave. That is, we are now in the age of artificial intelligence again. So now, looking back to our system of productions, our system of education, whatsoever, our capital is our human thinking. That is why now we don't consider land as capital. We don't consider as other means of productions, industry as capital, but our brain, our system of thinking as our capital. And in order to decolonize ourselves, there is no other options, but we have to take our thinking very productively, and there is no other way, but we have to enterprise our thinking process. That is why thinking is capital, enterprise is the way, and there is no other options but hard work is the solutions. Because the whole thing is being controlled by the data, And we have to really invest our mind to understand the data. Because in the past, where precious metal has been used for currency, but after that we use paper money. Now, when we look back to our system of exchange, as Alvin Toffler has written in his book, saying that one symbol will run from a computer to another computer, and all the exchange will take place. That is the age where we are in. That is why I would like to remind all of us, unless we learn, unlearn, and relearn, we shall be considered as illiterate in this century. Thank you.